Okay, we're going to give it about another 30 seconds because it looks like there are quite a few people just joining now. And then we will go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our quarterly webinar based on an article from the Foundation Review. Today we're going to be discussing Inside Foundation Evaluation. The Foundation Review is published by the Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. I just want to, before we get into substantive stuff, a couple of technical housekeeping issues here. I suggest you jot down this 800 number and the email address here. If you are experiencing any technical glitches during the webinar, you can call our ReadyTalk helpline at 800-843-9166 or email help@readytalk.com, and they are very helpful. We will be having some times for question and answer during the webinar. We'd like to ask you to use the chat feature on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. There's a place where you can type in questions, and then I will be posing those questions to our presenters at a couple points during the presentation. This webinar is based on benchmarking evaluation in foundations. Do we know what we are doing? That's in the current issue of the Foundation Review. Today's agenda is a brief set of introductory comments from me, which you're now getting. Then we will hear from Julia Kaufman and Tanya Bier, our article authors, and then we will open up for questions and comments. That's me. I'm moderator. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Foundation Review and the director of special projects at the Johnson Center for Philanthropy. Our presenters today are Julia Kaufman and Tanya Bier with the Center for Evaluation Innovation. Julia has done some previous webinars for us. Many of you know her for the work that she did on evaluating advocacy in the past, and she's now launched the Center for Innovation Evaluation. Tanya Bier has been an author for the Foundation Review in the past and was formerly at the Colorado Trust and is now the Associate Director of the Center for Evaluation Innovation. Before I turn it over to them, we want to find out a little bit about who you are, who's on the call with us. So, somebody's already started answering here. I'd like you can go ahead and click on screen here and let us indicate what type of organization you currently work with. Okay, it looks like somebody did something here that didn't make it not work. Okay, we are going to go on to the next question, which is what is your primary job responsibility? And if you click on one of those and then click submit, there we go. We'll see this results showing up on screen here. We have about 10 more people who are on who haven't responded yet, so we give it just a couple more seconds. But you can see that a little over a third of the participants on the call, about somewhere around 30, depending on as results come in, around 40% have evaluation as their primary job responsibility. About a third have grant making as their primary responsibility. And then we have a smattering of learning, program management, and other. So that's who's on the call, the backgrounds that they're bringing. So now I'd like to turn this over to our presenters, Julia and Tanya.
Great, thanks so much, Terry. This is Tanya Bier, and we just want to thank the Foundation Review and the folks at the Johnson Center at Grand Valley State University for hosting this. We're really pleased to be with you today and to talk about some of the findings that were presented in this latest edition of the Foundation Review about evaluation practices in foundations. The study we're going to share was conducted as part of the Evaluation Roundtable, which is a network of foundation evaluation leaders that was founded and led until just this past year by Patty Patrizzi. And Julia and I were fortunate to work with Patty and also Liz Thompson, who I think is on the call today, during the 2012 roundtable, from which this data comes. And Patty's since passed the baton of the Evaluation Roundtable on to us, and we're excited to continue doing the benchmarking work over time. We're just going to share some highlights from our study with you today. The study was designed to understand how the evaluation function within foundations is structured, how it's positioned and resourced, as well as perceptions of the kind of quality of evaluation use and support by foundation boards, executives, programmatic decision makers. To use the study, or to do the study, we used a web-based survey that was taken primarily by a lead evaluation staff person in a foundation. And those were followed by in-depth semi-structured phone interviews that lasted between 60 and 90 minutes. Now, it's important to note that this is definitely not a study of evaluation across all of philanthropy. It focuses specifically on foundations, a subset of primarily larger foundations, many of whom have a long history and commitment to evaluation. So our question is, what does the evaluation function look like within these kinds of foundations that have already made this commitment? So the survey included 31 foundations, which you can see here segmented by annual grant-making budget, so that we could try to detect patterns in evaluation function, investment, and use that might be different depending on foundation size. And incidentally, another important way that the participants differed is with regard to the evaluation reporting structure, which we'll discuss later. For roughly 2/3 of these respondents, the evaluation unit reports directly to the CEO, while others are roughly divided between reporting to a vice president or leader for programs or an administrative leader, such as the chief operating officer. In addition to these 31 survey takers, we had a total of 38 interviewees. So there were about 7 foundations that we did in-depth interviews with whose data are not included in the quantitative measures here. So we'd like to share with you 8 main findings and the questions they raised for us, and then briefly discuss what we think their implications might be before we turn it over and hopefully have a discussion with you about what you think the implications of these findings might be. So in addition to the Foundation Review article, there's also more detail about this data on our website, which is listed here on this page. Now, one important point before I start is that the use of the word evaluation in this study is focused more broadly on the use of evaluative information. There's not a clear line of what counts as evaluation and what doesn't in the foundation world any longer. So we're really using evaluation as shorthand for the whole suite of evaluative and evaluation-related activities, including knowledge management, strategic learning, and other kinds of data collection. So first, we wanted to note that we think that if you use as a signal the level of investment in evaluation and in evaluation staffing levels, those 2 indicators suggest that commitment to evaluation among these foundations is on the rise. Close to half of the respondents reported that they think evaluation investments relative to their grant-making budgets have increased in the last 2 years. Fewer than 20% saying their investments have decreased. Now, in 2009, it was a similar division, with 62% feeling that their investments in evaluation relative to grant-making had increased even in the middle of the recession, in the early days of the recession when people's endowment sizes were shrinking. So we speculate that perhaps this increased commitment is a durable one. It also shows up in the average number of FTEs dedicated to evaluation. So the average number has increased in the last few years, the last 2 years, from 3 to 4.2 among all foundations, although we did notice that among smaller foundations, the average number of evaluation FTE has dropped. Now, 3/4 of the foundations that we surveyed had at least one full-time person dedicated to evaluation-related activities at a director or manager level. However, there's a lot of variability among foundations. Some of the foundations with well over 100 staff have fewer evaluation FTE than mid or small-sized foundations with fewer than 20 staff. The range of total percent of staff that are dedicated to evaluation is about 0.5% to 14% of the total staff. Now, we have seen considerable churn in the naming of foundation units or departments in both this benchmarking survey and the 2009 benchmarking survey. Now, in 2012, more than a third of the interviewees had either created a new unit or changed the unit's name in the last 2 years. So upon probing in the interviews, we learned that the name changes tended to reflect either a broadening of responsibilities, for example, from evaluation to evaluation and learning, or a shift in focus and purpose of the evaluation, so from knowledge management to, for example, strategy and assessment. So as foundations are experimenting with increasingly complex strategies and decisions, they seem to simultaneously be tinkering with the role of the evaluation unit to try to cover a variety of different evaluative and learning tasks that will help the foundation understand its impact, manage complex information flows, improve performance, and learn what works. Now, as a result, we found that evaluation staff are also consequently juggling more and more distinct types of evaluative tasks or responsibilities. These range from performance metrics and measurement to evaluation at every level, from the individual grant level to initiatives or entire program areas or the foundation overall, partner and grantee satisfaction surveys, organizational learning processes or strategic learning. So we asked participants to tell us what percentage of total evaluation staff time is dedicated to this broad list of activities and any other that they might identify. We found that small foundations spend most of their time on individual grant evaluation, while larger foundations tend to focus on more time on evaluating initiative or program area levels. Now you'll see here on this chart that the vast majority of time is spent on the production of data compared to facilitating its use. So despite the recent name changes to include more of an emphasis on learning and improvement, we found that evaluation staff in small and mid-sized foundations spend just around 10% of their time on learning processes or events, things that facilitate how foundations make use of this increasing flow of data. But perhaps most interestingly is this point that the average foundation evaluation units spend time on about 6.5 different distinct types of tasks, many of which require very distinct skills and expertise. So on the one hand, this might be a really positive development. We think foundations are recognizing that different kinds of decisions at different levels require very different kinds of data on different cycles. And also we think that this signals that there's a lot, that foundations recognize that there's a lot to be learned during the work to become much more effective. But the interview process surfaced the complications that these sometimes conflicting demands for information create for the day-to-day work of evaluation staff. So the evaluation function is getting increasingly complex and difficult to manage. It's particularly hard for foundations who have a single FTE or less devoted to this position. So despite the increase in evaluation FTE that we discussed earlier, one of the questions it raises for us is whether the growth in evaluation time and investment is actually keeping pace with the increased demand for different types of information. I'm going to turn it over to Julia to cover the other findings.
Okay, so our next finding is that structure matters, and here we're talking really about the role or about how evaluation staffing is structured in a foundation. And like Tanya said earlier, remember we talked to some of the larger foundations in terms of their overall assets, and so that most foundations that participated in our research had evaluation directors. 3/4 had a full-time staff person at the director or manager level. Now there's been some debate in the field about where that director, if one exists, should sit in the organization to ensure that evaluation really has the greatest possible impact. And as you can see on the slide, there are really 3 main options here: reporting to the president or CEO, to an administrator like a COO, or to program leaders in the foundation. You can see in the bullet points there some of the arguments for the different positioning of each. I think Tanya also mentioned this earlier, as was the case in 2009 and again in in 2012, it's most common for the evaluation director to report directly to the CEO. Almost twice as many in our sample reported at that level compared to the other two. Now, but the thing we also want to mention here is that there are trade-offs to different positions. So, for example, you can see here on the slide that differences existed when we asked about the use of evaluation to inform grant-making decisions in foundations. So evaluation directors who reported to program leaders, that bottom tier where there's a red arrow there, said that they were most satisfied with evaluation's use by program staff. Now, but there are other advantages to directors who report differently. So, for example, in other questioning, we found that CEO reports have higher perceived levels of management support for evaluation and generally are more satisfied with the level of investment that foundations are making in evaluation. So structure matters, but there isn't really one right answer here about how to structure evaluation staff, and especially that evaluation director position. And many of the foundations we talk to are still experimenting with this to figure out what works best for them. All right, so with this fifth finding, I just want to mention that most of the foundations we talk to are what we call strategic philanthropists, which means that they seek to achieve their own clearly defined goals, pursue those goals in collaboration with grantees that they select, and then track their success in achieving them. So this fifth finding really stems from our interest in exploring the role that evaluation plays throughout the life cycle of grant-making strategies or program strategies. And we were pleased with the results that we saw here. Because we saw that evaluation staff are helping to inform program strategy, are working side by side with program staff in most of the foundations that we talk to, and are focused more on informing it throughout its life cycle. And for the most part, evaluation staff are doing these things in an ongoing way as strategies are developed and executed. And this is pretty different from what we saw in 2009, when foundations were saying that evaluation staff participation in strategy really dropped off considerably as strategies were executed. So there was a lot of involvement up front in theory of change development and then some involvement on the back end, but that really important middle segment, there was a drop-off in staff involvement. So we saw a change in 2012 on that. But even though we saw some positive findings about the integration of evaluation throughout the grant-making life cycle, our interviews still revealed a lot of frustration about the extent to which evaluation data are actually being used to examine and understand how strategies are unfolding on the ground, and then to use that information to make appropriate adjustments in the strategy. And we heard some pretty familiar barriers to the effective use of evaluation here, like staff time and workload, how timely the data is or are, and some organizational culture issues and negative attitudes about evaluation in general. But we heard some other things here too, and I just want to emphasize one of those. And that's that, that a growing emphasis on particular kinds of measurement may be detracting some attention from the types of evaluative work that can really help to guide strategy development and implementation. So a number of foundations we talked to mentioned increasing a portion of their evaluation resources to really focusing on what we think are oversimplified questions like, did we move the needle, or did we achieve our objectives? And these aren't really evaluation questions that help to navigate a lot of the complex problems that foundations face with their strategies and as their strategies are implemented. They oversimplify the situation and really cover up the need for knowledge that arises as strategies are on the ground. Okay, our next finding is on something that we're calling broad scope evaluation. And by that we mean that foundations have different levels at which they might look at their grant making or evaluate their grant making. And that can exist at the level of individual grants, clusters of grants, initiatives, portfolios or whole program areas, and then the overall foundation. And most evaluation investments, at least for the foundations in our sample, were focused at those smaller units of analysis in that spectrum: individual grants, clusters of grants, and initiatives, and particularly at the initiative level. But now we're seeing more interest farther up that grant-making chain to evaluation that takes place for overall program areas or overall portfolios as well as the foundation. And our paper, or our article, really goes more into this, but we think there are a lot of questions about how you evaluate usefully at this level of, at this broad scope level. We see a lot of foundations, for example, turning to dashboards at this level. And while we think that dashboards make some sense, particularly for reporting at an operational level on how many grants went out or what budgets looked at, or what budgets looked like and report out, et cetera, we think, or payout, we think it doesn't work that well, or dashboards don't work that well when it comes to reporting on impact. And we just want to flag this as an area where we think more work and thinking needs to be done. Our second to last finding is about support for evaluation at the executive level in foundations from management and from boards. And as you can see on the slide, there's some good news and some bad news here. On the good news side, there's a lot of verbalized support for evaluation and just a lot of perceived commitment for the idea of evaluation. On the bad news side, there's much less perceived use of evaluation at this level and few incentives for actually integrating evaluation into decision making in foundations. So for us, these data raise some questions about what meaningful leadership buy-in for evaluation means at the top levels. And we think we need some more thinking about the kinds of questions foundation leaders are asking and the information being supplied for them in response. And like I was saying earlier, to make executive level decisions about foundation strategies, we think leaders should ask much more than just, did we move the needle? And instead dig deeper and ask why or why not, how, and with whom. In our last slide, I just want to make some summary comments here. And in the yellow part of that slide, I just want to emphasize that some pretty profound changes have occurred in recent years for evaluation in philanthropy. We've seen more commitment to evaluation, increased resources, and evaluation is not a trend that's going to go away. It's here to stay. We see evaluation directors holding high-level positions, evaluation and program staff working together, and evaluation being positioned more as a support for strategy than just as a judge of it. But at the same time, there are a number of issues about evaluation foundations that are problems now and have been problems for a long time, and the main one is really about evaluation use and how we increase evaluation use. And just as a final comment on this, I mean, it's our position that, based on data and our own experience, that foundations are producing and supplying more data and information than ever. And there's a lot of attention being paid to sort of the supply side of this issue. But we think the demand side needs more attention. And rather than assume that more data is better, our research suggests that foundations should ask themselves a set of questions that might help them to maximize the utility of their evaluation investments. And you can see those questions written there in white about the resources and how they're being spread across the foundation, whether it's better to prioritize and go deeper on some things where it counts the most rather than to spread those resources out across a large number of evaluative activities. More attention to what it means to really devote attention and time to learning in the foundation. What does that actually mean? What does that really look like? And finally, what are the questions that CEOs and boards should be asking that can actually inform executive level decisions? So that concludes our presentation. I want to remind everybody that there's an article that's available that goes much more into this, as well as a presentation on our website that shows all of the data that we collected from the benchmarking research. So if you're interested in that, it's available free on our website.
Okay, thank you, Julia and Tanya. Let me give you some of the questions that have been coming in, and some that, as a moderator, I wanted to pose to you. So one question that came in was about the dashboards. Could you talk a little bit more about what you see as the problems with using dashboards to look at impact, and what other ways maybe of showing impact you might suggest, if not a dashboard?
Sure. This is Tanya. I'll start with that one. So I think we want to say, one, that we don't think that dashboards are necessarily a bad idea. It's that when kind of executed in the wrong way, they can actually be risky and kind of incentivize some decisions maybe in a less effective way. So we see a couple of different trends with dashboard use. On the one hand, we find that it's difficult to find single indicators that are easily communicable in a dashboard format that really accurately represent the work of the foundation in complex areas. So oftentimes what that means is that foundations will create dashboards with population-level indicators that don't actually reflect the extent to which the foundation itself and its work is contributing to population-level changes, or it causes boards to look at population-level indicators prematurely before you could expect an investment to actually produce changes in those big needle concepts. So that's one way. A second way is that often dashboards discourage the use of qualitative data where you can actually find information that can be more useful to understand how things are working, under what conditions, and for whom. And so sometimes that idea of trying to get that very small, quick snapshot of data to represent your work can produce a misleading picture about what's happening. And so dashboards might work best for either less complex situations or when they're accompanied by other kinds of data that actually help get at what is the contribution of the foundation, what are the mitigating factors, what are some of the ways that those needles might be being affected by larger issues and trends in the environment over which the foundation doesn't have control. So it's more of a kind of a cautionary note about the role of dashboards in communicating information about impact.
Yeah, I would just add that, just to emphasize that I think for those of us who have tried to use dashboards to demonstrate impact, that it rarely, if ever, happens that things really roll up in a way, well, they don't aggregate well, let's say, across grantees or across strategies, or aggregate in a way that makes sense. You can really boil down to a single data point. So that, at least I personally have had trouble with that, and I know a lot of people have. And in addition, there's this question of if you can get data points that relate to impact at an overall foundation level, are they really meaningful? Are they telling you something that you can use? And Tanya talked more about that. But
Okay, great, thanks. So one of the questions that raised for me was there's been this significant amount of discussion about collective impact and the idea of developing common indicators or shared indicators to do collective work at the community level. How do you see, or do you see, the issues you were just talking about related to that? I think so. I mean, to give you my bias, I think the collective impact framework and shared indicators are a double-edged sword. It is very helpful for getting a community together, getting organizations to focus, and it can grossly oversimplify because you end up with that kind of dashboard, least common denominator metric. I'm interested in your reactions to that.
Well, my instinct is I think I agree to a great extent, actually, Terry, with your assessment of that. I think that thinking about what shared indicators are for in a collective impact context is very important. So the idea that common indicators can really serve, as you said, to focus how a community thinks about and understands a problem and maintain commitment to the effort. And if they can serve as the basis through which people understand and have a deeper discussion about, well, how is it that we can, what is our role or niche related to this larger indicator that actually captures, in many ways, the efforts of a whole variety of people, that kind of common data, common indicators can be, I think, incredibly important tool in that context. I do agree also, I think, we've seen folks go to both extremes of finding the 2 or 3 or 5 common indicators that serve that unifying purpose, compared to groups that find 500 indicators that they're trying to track because they're looking for things that speak to their own individual contribution. So I think the other kind of risk in the shared measurement approach is how do you find the indicators that serve the right purpose for the right players without kind of paralyzing your group with too much information that they, in fact, then don't know how to use. So I think there's definitely an art to that, to the role of the indicators. And the larger evaluation questions still apply. Indicators don't necessarily tell you anything about causality or complex dynamics or why does something work or not work or in what circumstances. And so understanding what they're for and what they're not for, I think, is an important step in any kind of collective effort.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question that came in. I wonder if the challenge of evaluation use is a cultural one. This echoes the conversation about evidence use in informing public policy. Perhaps now we need to ask what kind of information informs decisions at different levels. What role does evaluation play in this, and how could we increase the influence of evaluation findings in this decision making? I think that's more of a comment than a question, but neither of you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of evaluation use is a complex one that has a lot of different parts. Culture is certainly one of them, and we heard a lot about that in our research. And there are a lot of questions about how do you increase or how do you change foundation culture so that it's more attuned to evaluation use and particularly learning. And then we also, I just wanted to mention that we didn't talk about this on the webinar, but we have seen a lot of the foundations that we talked to changing their processes to incorporate more time for reflection, learning meetings, et cetera. So they're carving out more time for reflection and attention to data and information, which we think is a really important thing to do. At the same time, we still heard some frustration about how useful that time is and what we could do to make that more useful. And so we've done some work, or we're trying to do more work on questions about how to structure that reflection time so it really facilitates more learning, and that includes paying attention to what information is at the table, who is at the table, and how information is actually connected to strategic decisions.
Mm-hmm. I think on a related note, I mean, one of the points I enjoyed learning from the interviewees was this issue about what does it actually mean to have leadership buy-in? Because it's one of the most common points people make about a barrier to the use of data and evaluation is leadership buy-in. And so while people say we get so much messaging from up the chain about how valuable data and evaluation is to our work, at the same time, people gave very negative responses about how frequently they see leadership themselves model the use of evaluation and data for decision making. So there's something about pushing on kind of truisms like leadership is important and saying, so how does that support manifest itself? What is it that leadership specifically has to do and say, and how do they have to behave differently to actually incentivize the use of data at those tables? Can they, for example, include the use of data in staff performance measurements and performance expectations? How do they demonstrate the use of data in their own executive level decision making? So there's something too about pushing as a field past those kind of cliches about what it takes to address cultural issues and really getting specific that I think is important.
Okay, thank you. All right, I have another question. Can you talk a little bit more about how evaluation staff are handling this challenge of having a broader set of responsibilities? Did you learn anything from your interviews about how they're coping with that? Are they doing more internal trainings? Are they trying to enlist other staff in evaluative thinking? Are they using more contract support? Or just any insights you have into that?
I think we heard all of those that you just mentioned, Terry, but this is an issue, frankly, and I think in the article used the term that evaluation staff are feeling a little punch drunk from their multiple responsibilities, because there's a tendency, we heard a tendency that if something doesn't appear to be working that well in the foundation, so if the dashboard's not working that well, for example, there's a tendency to add more rather than to either refine what already exists or to say, hey, that's not working for us, maybe we should do something else instead. So there's an additive element to evaluation tasks and activities rather than let's prioritize and really go deep where it matters most for us.
And kind of a follow-up on that, somebody else just posed the question, if you have any illuminating stories or examples about how foundations have set priorities about focusing evaluation resources. Any good examples of that? Ooh, okay. All right. I'm wondering if that often falls to the evaluation person sort of by default to do that prioritizing rather than being a conscious strategic decision at the executive, the CEO level or program level.
Yeah, exactly. I think we heard a couple of folks talk a little bit about trying to have the conversation about the trade-offs between the different options. So, for example, if we invest in these resources in performance measurement approaches, and what do we gain from that? What do we understand better? And versus, for example, spending those evaluation resources to understand, how a strategy is unfolding on the ground. What do you gain? What do you do better with that information? And I don't know that a lot of folks have come up with a really systematic way to do that besides having that conversation in a really strategic way that focuses on trade-offs.
Okay, if we do this, what are we not going to do? Kind of conversation.
And this isn't directly addressing your question, but I also wanted to mention something else about evaluation staff that we saw in our data, and especially about evaluation directors, which is that the background of the staff that are being hired appears to be changing a bit. So I think in the past it was more of a focus on social science research, people who have done evaluation in the field who are more methodologists. And we see, in part because the scope of what's expected from evaluation is expanding, that the backgrounds have changed to incorporate people who have other skills related to learning or communication or organizational development, et cetera. So that's something else we wanted to note.
Okay. Another question is about grantee evaluation capacity. Did you hear anything about that, learn anything about that in this work? How to build, does building grantee evaluation capacity help with foundation learning and evaluation?
We didn't focus on that topic specifically in our research. I think it's, as I said, most of the foundations we talk to are strategic philanthropists, and so the primary user of evaluation in that case is the foundation itself, and there is a focus on grantee capacity as contributors to the learning about the strategy. But we heard less about building grantees' own evaluative capacity for their own learning.
Which itself has lots of implications and raises a ton of questions, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. A couple other questions, sort of building off of that strategic philanthropy thread. Do you have any examples or any observations about foundations that are more responsive grant makers and the role that evaluation plays in those types of foundations?
There were definitely fewer of those in our research, and I think there's some other studies that have a broader scope that we should look to for that. But just sort of speaking from the conversations that we had with folks in this process, responsive grant makers, of course, tend to focus more, and additionally smaller foundations, right, tend to focus more on evaluation at the individual grant unit, which makes sense, right, given that structure. The challenges they sometimes face is when boards still ask questions about overall impact, and there's a disconnect, right, between being able to, this idea that Julia brought up earlier about being able to roll up data from individual grants that are responsive into some conclusions about foundation impact presents a real challenge for evaluation directors who are then kind of in a pickle to think about, well, if in fact these things aren't intended to be a cohesive strategy, how could we represent them as cohesive, with a cohesive conclusion? And so there's a lot of, I think, of education work as well to be done with boards to make sure that their evaluative questions fit the structure and approach of the foundation's grant making, rather than following a different trend. If you're a responsive grant maker, what are the appropriate sets of evaluative questions to be asking at the board level?
And that's actually something that we're doing more work on now, which is looking at the different spectrum of different approaches to grant making, whether it's responsive, whether it's focusing on initiatives or clusters of grants or strategic philanthropy, et cetera, and looking at if you take different approaches across that spectrum, what are the implications in terms of evaluation staffing, the role of grantees, the role of program officers, what evaluation looks like at the beginning, middle, and end, et cetera. So that's something we're doing right now.
Okay, great. If your foundation is currently using evaluation primarily as a reporting tool, how do you move towards using evaluation to inform strategy and to inform strategic grant making? What are some of the practices that you saw or that you know of that help make that shift?
Well, there are some basic things to start with, which include building evaluation in at the beginning and making sure that evaluation, whether it's external or internal, is something that's thought of at the beginning. In addition, making sure that the evaluation questions you're focused on are relevant to directly relevant to strategy and how strategy is rolling out or being implemented, and not just focused on the back end, what was the impact, what was the result.
Yeah, and one of the things, if that shift is happening or not happening because of the positioning of the board, right, the activities of the board or executive leadership, there's also, I think, some opportunities for, sometimes people have assumptions about how change happens in complex situations that might not be quite right, sort of looking for levels of predictability that aren't quite right, or levels of magnitude of change that don't match resources. So sometimes that board-level conversation about what will help us do our work better with peer foundations that can actually illustrate what a learning orientation looks like goes the furthest to convince boards to shift. There's something about having to see it in action that makes folks think differently about the value of a learning orientation. You can't, in my experience, you can sort of talk about it, but if people have a kind of natural reaction against it, or it sounds like a bunch of process, it's hard to see how it's value added.
Okay, great. We have one request with a very specific tool. Somebody is looking for a tool to help evaluate social change in a collaborative setting. So I don't know if there's just maybe a quick reference that one of you might give, or if anybody else on the webinar has such a tool, put that in chat and I can send it out to everyone. But Julia or Tanya, do you have a recommendation? This is for a funding network.
Not an immediate. Yeah, I think we need to know a little bit more about.
Okay, why don't I suggest that person just get in touch with you directly?
That works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also,
all right, great.
A lot of the resources that are related to collective impact, that although collective impact is a specific model, there's a lot of good stuff around the collective impact discussion and evaluation of collective impact efforts that's really useful about collaborative settings.
Okay, thank you. Any sense of what gets cut out of budgets first? Evaluation, marketing, communications, grant making? And I think it's interesting that you did this study during an economic downturn when you might have thought that evaluation might have been on the chopping block, but it doesn't appear to have been. So just any observations about that?
Wow, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I don't know. Nothing based on data, right? We don't have any data on that.
Okay.
But we've spent a lot of time actually talking about how strategic communications and evaluation are sort of the two main auxiliary functions in foundations. One or the other tends to be the first to go, and it kind of seems to depend on how embedded the function is in the actual strategy of the organization. So the extent to which it feels external or auxiliary, which, if you do foundation only as a reporting mechanism and not as a strategic learning mechanism, it's much more, people tend to treat it, I think, as much more disposable than if it's embedded in strategy. And the same goes for communications. For those foundations that have really done a lot of work to say communications is actually integral to achieving our goals, are much less likely to chop communications when the time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yep.
Okay. One question about methodology. Were the interviews with foundation staff, were there any foundation board members interviewed? And I'm just curious about any differences in perceptions, opinions between the two, if so.
No, we did not interview board members. We interviewed the person that is most directly responsible for evaluation and evaluative decisions in the foundation. So often that was the evaluation director, and occasionally it was an executive level person in the foundation.
Okay.
But it would be fascinating. We'd love to interview boards and program leads on some of these same questions and try to explore why those perceptions might be different. I suspect if you interview program directors and VPs about their use of evaluation, their responses might be very different, right, about the extent to which they feel they use evaluation.
Yeah, as somebody who worked in a foundation evaluation role at one point, I would definitely echo that their staff and boards really do look at evaluation differently, and that's getting them on the same page is, I think, a key challenge for foundation evaluators. How about outside evaluators? A question on how often do evaluators hire outside researchers and consultants? Did you get any data on that?
No, again, no specific questions about that, though we did recognize that quite a few of the foundations who have expanding scopes of responsibility in their evaluation unit handle that expanded scope by contracting out. So as people, for example, add performance measurement to a suite of evaluation strategies, there's a lot of going out and finding performance management consultants to help them instead of actually building internal capacity to do that work. That's a quick way to respond to those new requests.
Although I would also add, I think that's true, I would also add that I think there is also a trend happening. I'm not sure yet. We don't really have data on it, but there's a trend to see program staff and to work with program staff as more participants in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning process, particularly on the monitoring and learning side of things. And that there's a lot that program officers do in their day-to-day jobs as engaged grant makers that counts as evaluative and is part of that process. So it's a combination of external and an increasing focus, we think, on internal.
Yeah. And actually, come to think of it, if you look at the fuller data set that's on our website, we did ask folks to talk a little bit about who has primary responsibility for different functions, evaluative functions, and we did see an increase in program staff being more responsible for more evaluation work by themselves, which also I would imagine raises a workload question for program staff, just like it does for evaluation staff.
Okay, great. We had a couple
questions
that are sort of related. Let's see if I can articulate a common question that gets at both of them. It's regarding how you would apply these findings to the smaller foundations that don't have this level of resources for evaluation. Are there lessons from this that you would think might be helpful or appropriate for those kinds of foundations? And in particular, maybe any kind of a trajectory or a path. Is there a kind of a pathway that a smaller foundation might take to start developing that evaluation capacity?
You know, I think this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, where I think that the way to look at this is more about what type of grant making you're doing, perhaps more than the size of the foundation. And by that, just as a reminder, I mean, do you do responsive grant making? Do you do initiatives? Do you do your own strategies, et cetera? And most of our research, again, is about foundations that do a combination of things, but primarily are strategic grant makers. And so, again, that's an area that we want to do more on for different types of grant making, and how the findings and the questions that we've asked here are different for different approaches.
Yeah. I think that one of the translations for me is, when it comes down to it, for the value, one of the biggest value adds for evaluation in a foundation context is, do you do what you do well? Do you do what you do well, and is it the sort of highest leverage thing you could be doing, given how you think about your work and what your organizational values are? And so, in smaller foundations or bigger foundations that have less of their own internally designed and managed strategies and do more responsive grant making, I think it bears some deep thinking about, well, what does it mean to be responsive in a really effective way? And that's how to focus begin thinking about how to focus the evaluation function, is to say, yeah, what is it, how are we doing a good job of responding effectively? Are we doing a good job of making decisions between all of these possible good options that we could be doing? And what kinds of evaluation questions surface from that kind of grant making? What we don't want to argue is that everybody should be one type of grant maker and therefore do evaluation in one type of way. But instead to do a better job of pairing up your evaluation approach with the core identity of the foundation and organization.
So the evaluation approach has to support the overall grant-making approach is really the key takeaway there. We did get another question about going beyond that, did we move the needle question. Can you provide an example of a grant program and the types of questions that you would suggest asking? So let's just, I think there's a lot of focus on early childhood, for example, in the last couple of years. If you're supporting an early childhood, early learning grant portfolio, what suggestions would you have about the types of questions that would be most appropriate?
I think it's going to depend on the type of strategy that people are using. And so I'll just give an example from my own experience with one foundation that invests in early childhood and invests in a lot of advocacy work around that issue. And so the questions that the board in this case had was not just, hey, have we accomplished the policy outcomes that we were after, but what have we changed about public will or political will to set up opportunities for longer-term policy changes or support on this issue. In addition, they were interested in knowing for foundation staff what didn't work, and when it didn't work, what did you do about it? So they were much more interested in the adaptation of the strategy and the sort of adaptive capacity that the foundation had, rather than, hey, what was just the ultimate outcome?
Yeah. And on a program delivery front, the sort of related question is, boards often asking for dashboard metrics that say things like, did we increase the number of children at third grade reading level, in year one of a systems change initiative, for example? And so when you do dashboards that focus on those children, like child level outcomes, that's of course the sort of North Star of your work, right, that people stay oriented around and you need to sort of have a long-term attention to. But if your grant making is designed to affect how, a small set of players interact together, the needle you're trying to move is their interaction. That's the first needle you have to move before you'd ever expect the longer-term needle to move. And so trying to orient boards towards asking the right question at the right stage of development of initiative or a grant-making strategy, as well as actually asking about the specific needles that your grant-making is likely to move as opposed to the population level ones, that's a much more important set of questions, I think, if you're really serious about thinking about how your foundation is contributing to the change.
Okay, great. And then the final question here was just a terminology question. When you say grant staff and program staff, are you using those as the same thing?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we want to thank all of our participants. Great questions, great conversation. And Julia and Tanya, thank you so much for being with us today. Everybody who is on the webinar will be getting a link to the slides and to the recording of the webinar. For those of you who are not a subscriber, feel free to contact Robert Shallett and you can apply today's fee to a subscription. And next month, the date has not yet been set yet, but we will have part 2 of this discussion. Patty Patrizi will be joining us to talk more about the strategic use of evaluation and learning as a strategy. So again, thank you all, and that concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.